How's it going, guys? My name is Zach with the Movie Castle, and today we're going to be taking a look at Vampiress Carmilla, issue number 15 for July of 2023. For those of you guys who are new to this, Vampiress Carmilla, as well as its sister magazine Shudder, are black and white, classically styled anthology horror stories. If you like things like the classic monsters and other classic horror tropes, you get to see a ton of that here, but always reinvented and told in a slightly different way to keep things fresh and with some fun, unpredictable twist that you won't necessarily be able to guess. We have some, like I said, reinventions in here. We have a story about Dr. Victor Karlstein, a clear play on Frankenstein, but what happens with his creature is very different than what happens with Frankenstein's creature. We also get a story where the werewolf curse goes out of control and becomes a pandemic. So two classic monsters, very different stories. We also get a fun cameo in this magazine that I won't talk about just quite yet, but a fun face does show up right at the beginning. As always, this magazine is incredibly consistent. The stories are always fun, and it's always just a really good read, especially if you like classic horror and the old comics, so I can definitely recommend this. Anyway, if you guys want to see a little more of this issue, I'm going to switch to the close-up camera. We'll take a closer look at the stories and the art, but I won't do any major spoilers. I'll be avoiding those twists. Anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and switch to the close-up camera. Alright, here we are inside the castle taking a closer look at Vampiress Carmilla number 15 for July 2023. And we got the Carmilla logo in green, a very dark green, moody cover for this one, featuring a woman getting taken away by strange, mysterious ape creatures. This is a Francetta cover. There's the signature, but it's also on the inside credits page. And I guess I should have to mention, I'll do this really quick because I say this a lot for the magazine, I did have to censor it. This is just a bit of a post-it note here, and I take them off right after the review's done. As we know, YouTube flips out inconsistently and quite often, and you never really know what they're gonna get mad at. And yeah, there's a breast there, so had to censor it. YouTube's idea, not mine. I work hard for the videos and don't want them to punish me for it. Anyway, on the inside cover we get Carmilla's scary tales, and this time around she's talking about old hags, and we see she says that old hags are, different than just old creepy witches or something, and these are spiritual entities. And she talks about sleep paralysis, how the witches would sit on your chest and give you bad dreams, and that even modern day spiritualists consider sleep paralysis to be a semi-paranormal state. Here's them talking about Peg Prowler, who was a specific English one who would drag kids into the water and eat them. There's Spirits of the Storms, and then talking about how sometimes they'll look beautiful but have the hidden side, and can you accept them with their secret old hag form. So an interesting story there, but I think, old hags does kind of embody a wide range of characters there. But after that we get the credits, and you get to see all the credits. Remember that cover credit I mentioned earlier. Carmilla's Blood Letters, The Perfect Mate, Jungle Love, Across the Aisle, The New Abnormal, Vamp Champ, Carmilla's Fan Club, and Youre So Vain. And we get some nice preview images about what some of these stories will have in them. And then after that, we get Carmilla's letter page, and we get to see them talking about The Show Must Vamp On, which was a Carmilla story, and they actually say that they're going to do more stories featuring Carmilla in them, not just the character introductions, well, she's in the introduction piece to the book all the time, but they said that outside of the spooktaculars, the annuals, that number 12 was the first time she had a full story in the magazine regular, and that they want to try to do that more, and I say that's a good idea, she's a fun character, and I love to see her going on adventures in the magazine, and it looks like the very next issue will feature one, so that is pretty cool. Anyway, moving on from the letters page into the stories proper, before we get into these stories, I just want to say I won't be doing any major spoilers. I'll be avoiding the twist, and I'll try not to go too far into each story, but I do want to do little mini reviews for each story and make sure you guys have a basic understanding as to what they're about. Anyway, without further ado, into the stories. We get the Vampiress Carmilla the Vampiress Carmilla introduction page here, and we get someone sneaking in and stealing Carmilla's story ideas. Now, I do want to say, that is kind of one thing I wonder, when Carmilla tells the stories to the monsters, some of them she references as real stories, but these are story ideas. So I guess some of the stories are real, and some of the stories are made up. Well, I guess if there's a story that the whole world ends or something, I guess that would have to be made up because, it didn't end in this story. So it's kind of curious. I wonder which ones of the stories she made up and which ones are real stories and which ones were just in the library. But anyway, these zombies act as a security system. Carmilla comes in and is actually old Aunt Shudder from the Shudder Magazine, the magazine made by the same publishers, and it's cool to see a crossover. And she says, I won't let you have my story ideas, but why don't you hang around? And we actually get old Aunt Shudder introducing the first story, which I think is pretty fun. The rest of the stories are hosted by Carmilla like normal, but we do get Aunt Shudder coming in and telling us the first one. And this one's entitled The Perfect Mate. And here we get a Victor Frankenstein-like character, but it's Karlstein, and he is destroying his creature and running away. And then it talks about how life goes on, and he thinks the creature is dead, and he's there with his mother recovering from the trauma, and then he'll meet a beautiful woman, and he'll fall instantly in love with her, and life seems to be going good. But perhaps too good. It's one of those things, and it is Victor's life in the story there, is I just made this creature, and in the original Mary Shelley novel, he just runs off initially, and he thinks, okay, did I really see that or what? But here they're putting it at the point in the story where the creature seems to be dead, and he's trying to move on, and it is that kind of peculiar point in your life where you think, okay, I think the creature's dead, but I don't know. But of course, calling him Karlstein instead of Frankenstein means that this is its own continuity, and you don't know what's going to happen. But needless to say, there is a bit of unease knowing that this life can't be perfect for too long, and some creepy twist is bound to happen. So, I will say I did like that. There is a fun, creepy twist, and I wonder how soon till you guys guess it. But it is a really fun idea. Anyway, after that, we get the story Jungle Love, where we can see Carmilla there in her hat. She's back to hosting. And there are these British explorers, and it turns out they're looking for a lost city in the jungle. There's their guide, who's from around there, and his beautiful daughter. And they say, how can someone like that have such a beautiful daughter? And eventually they'll be walking through the jungle when their guide goes missing, and his daughter is taken by these strange men. And yeah, that's the cover of the magazine right there. I really do like when they recreate the covers in the story themselves. So they're going to go through the jungle trying to save their friends while simultaneously getting picked off by these strange creatures. And we'll get a strange reveal as to what they actually are. Now, I won't spoil it, but the ending of this story is kind of uncomfortable. And, you know, it is a horror magazine. Bad things happen in horror stories, and I get that. But I'm curious to see what you guys' reception of the end of this story will be, because, yeah, this has a dark and uncomfortable ending behind it. Anyway, after that, we get the story Across the Aisle, and we get one of those fantastic giant Carmillas looking in at the little world, and there's a magician, and he's struggling. You know, no one really wants to see his show. The few kids that show up mock him and leave, and they say there's a successful magician across the row, or, well, the title of the story, Across the Aisle. So they're going to see the successful magician show and see what's up, and it turns out he's hired a new assistant, and they have an act where they can predict the future, and one of them's like, you know, they're giving testimonials, and she's like, they said to check my brakes, and I did, and they were bad, and I my life is saved because I did that, and they don't know what their gag is. Now, we get a bit of a flashback. He's a magician and needs his hands, but they're shaking a little bit, and that's because when he was young, he got bit by an armadillo and barely made it out with his life. Luckily, the doctor got him medicine. Now, this is kind of an out-of-nowhere flashback, so it'll probably come into play sometime later in the story, but he will go to see the other magician and say, hey, what's up with this new girl? And I bet you it will go completely amicably, and they'll have just a nice discussion, right? Needless to say, some backstabbing and betrayal, but when they reveal what's really going on here, they do introduce another plot element that I think really complements what we know, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. We get one that does this, and then another thing that goes in, and it's kind of the different way there. Trying my best not to just spoil anything, but I did like that. Anyway, after that we get the story, The New Abnormal, and we have the humans up there on their gates shooting at vampires with precious and rare silver bullets, and a woman comes in, and she seems to be unbidden, but she doesn't have her collar on. More on that in a second. So they take her in to examine her to make sure she's not a werewolf, and we get a bit of a history of this world. How Romania, after the current pandemic, Romania gets another pandemic, and a plane comes in, and all of a sudden werewolves are in this small town, and they talk about how there was a werewolf outbreak in Romania, and then there was a disease which caused the werewolves to mutate, and now you get things like werewolves are out even when it's not a full moon, and that's why people are wearing the collars, is because the werewolf will go for your throat, and if you have a steel collar on, then they're not going to be able to bite through. But because the werewolves mutate and change, they learn to start going for things other than the neck. And I think it's a really interesting concept. Again, it does try to mirror the pandemic that just happened. You know, instead of masks, you have these collars, and the way the disease kind of, spread and kind of came about overnight, and everybody worrying about mutations and stuff. And I think it is kind of interesting to, you get like YouTube videos talking about how old classic movies were influenced by, traumatic events of their time, and to see this happening in real time, and to see how our pandemic has influenced fiction, and how these things metaphorically come about in other ways, is going to be an interesting thing, so I do kind of wonder what movies people will make after having dealt with everything that we've done, Anyway, after that, we get a fun sports horror story. Sports horror is kind of rare, so always cool to see it. And also one thing, a Lou Mogan story. He, of course, recently passed away, if you guys haven't heard, but he wrote a few stories for Shudder and Carmilla that they're able to release after his death. So one of the last remaining Lou Mogan stories, so treasure it while you can. This is Vamp Champ, and we get Carmilla there ready to go boxing, and it talks about how in this remote cabin there's a secret boxing venue where vampires box each other for blood and money. And that's what the thing is, when one vampire pins the other, they can drink their blood. And apparently, yeah, they just need blood and they can steal it from each other. In a lot of other vampire continuities, vampires only can have human blood, but in this one, they can steal it from each other, so, you know, you get your prize for winning, but you can also drain someone of their blood, and she is actually killing people, and they say, you're allowed to do that, but you don't have to do that. But she loves to eliminate her competition, it makes for a better show, and they're not going to come back and get her. And you get a little bit of a history about how this whole thing was set up, and how she is like the champion, but she's taking it much too violently. But of course, she is going to get into bigger and harder fights. And overall, a fun story. The ending happens a little bit abruptly, and it is a story that I could do with a lot more of, but still a really fun thing, and combining sports and horror, especially, you know, essentially a secret vampire underground fight club, that's pretty fun. So I definitely did like this story. And I think after this, we're once again moving on to the end of the magazine. Well, okay, wait, we got the fan club page before the last story. Rags to Riches. It talks about this guy, he made a film, but it flopped, and he's, you know, wanting to make it in Hollywood, but no one's calling him back. So he goes to the grave of his hero, Stephen B. Rousseau III, and is going to try to do some ritual. And we get stories about both his history and Stephen's history and movie making. It's pretty interesting, and a ton of Easter eggs. Obviously, like, even the guy's name, Stephen B. Rousseau, is kind of a play on George A. Romero. Replace George with Stephen because George Romero was friends with Stephen King. Replace Romero with Rousseau, the co-writer of Night of the Living Dead. And A becomes B because alphabet, right? But there's a ton of other references and gags in this story. It is pretty fun. And then we get a drawing of Carmilla there in this cool comic booky style of her rising through the fog. And yeah, that's pretty fun. Always gotta love the letters page. The fan club page, they're doing a lot with, which I think that's pretty nice. Anyway, Youre So Vain, the final story in this issue, and we get this model, and she's a really good, renowned model. Everyone knows and likes her, and she starts to see a tiny wrinkle, even though she really looks fine. She is going to figure out how to save herself, because she's worried about aging. Again, even though she shouldn't, because she looks really nice, and she sees her competition, who's much older than her, but somehow still looks young. And the friend says, or the makeup assistant says, oh, it's probably Botox. And then we get right there with the needle in the eye. But needless to say, it's not going to go well. Yeah, whenever you get anthology horror and you want something a little too much, yeah, it's going to always be just out of your reach. And her trying to go and constantly try to get her beauty back, even though, ironically, it never really left, is an interesting story. And the ending of this one is kind of one of those out-of-nowhere endings, but hey, it's a fun horror magazine. We can pull a little bit of out-of-nowhere horror shenanigans. So overall, once again, I think the magazine was really fun, incredibly consistent, and always cool to see the crossover with Shudder Magazine there. I would, they're talking about doing more Carmilla stories in the magazine itself. Maybe old Aunt Shudder will show up a few more times. You know, the ghoul lunatics from the Tales from the Crypt EC magazines did talk to each other a lot, so cool to see Shudder show up here as well. Anyway, to everyone who's watched so far, thank you for watching. To everyone who's liked and subscribed, thank you. You really are helping the channel out. I'll leave a relevant playlist on the bottom. This should be my Creeps/Carmilla/Shudder playlist. If you guys want to see me talk about more of the magazine, I've made several of these videos, and I believe I've talked about all of the issues that are out of both Shudder and Carmilla so far, so there's a lot of videos here if you want to see them. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Relevant playlist on the bottom. Have a good day now.